Picture this. It's France in the late 1950s and a couple of movie-loving cinephiles including Truffaut and Godard have published a renowned film journal called the Cahiers du Cinéma. These critics wrote extensively about cinema and developed their ideas. They championed directors like Alfred Hitchcock and Nicholas Ray, promoting the concept of the auteur. Feeling critical and rebellious towards the established film industry at the time, which was dominated by studio-bound and predictable narratives, these individuals were influenced by the Italian neorealists and the American filmmakers. These critics turned filmmakers' approach to challenge conventions and sought to rejuvenate French cinema, and in turn, the future of cinema itself. This is the French New Wave.
Les 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. J'ai fait du cheval tout l'été.
When talking about the French New Wave or the Nouvelle Vague, the concepts of the auteur stands out. These young Frenchmen argued that the voice behind the films or the primary vision behind a project should be the director. Additionally, the film's aesthetic, overarching themes and overall mood should be recognizable and consistent from the other work. Many filmmakers today have been influenced by this idea of the auteur. Quentin Tarantino, Spike Lee, Martin Scorsese or Ari Aster, to name a few. This auteur theory inspired directors to tell stories through their own lens, often drawing inspiration from their own life experiences. These stories often feel personal, and the fingerprints of the auteur brings authenticity to the piece of cinema. In terms of visual style, a couple of elements stand out throughout the movement, whether it's the editing, camera movement, shooting on location, or even casting non-actors. The backbone of all this was the relatively low budget for these productions, and the need to shy away from the restrictions of traditional form of French cinema. Filmmakers used handheld cameras and shot almost always in real locations with practical or natural lights. No fancy sound stages and no fancy lighting rigs. In contrast to a very traditional static camera, this documentary style of filmmaking allowed the filmmakers to experiment with interesting camera movements that react with the actors. The camera stylo was a theory that stated that in the same way a writer uses their pen, a director should use their camera. The camera was simply a character in the film, playing one of the most important roles. And not to mention, shooting on location allowed the characters to interact with the space. Take a look at this scene from Breathless. These people in the background aren't extras. Well, I think this brings an authenticity to the story and makes the characters feel like they're a part of a bigger world. But of course, the first thing you'd notice from a film from the New Wave is the editing. This fast-paced style of editing was revolutionized by the New Wave. When traditional forms of cinema prioritized maintaining continuity and invisible editing, the French New Wave took a more in-your-face approach. The purpose of this style of filmmaking was to make the audience aware that they were watching a film. The use of montage, jump cuts, and freeze frames drastically improved the pacing in film as it prioritized story over continuity. Let's take a look at the opening scene from Breathless, Godard's first feature. Breathless came out in the 1960s, starring Belmondo and Seberg. This was one of the first films that came out from the New Wave and revolutionized cinema. Critics often proclaim Breathless a masterpiece. The premise of Breathless's uniqueness is that it embraces an exhausted genre, the Hollywood B-grade crime film, as a representation of reality. This scene is a goldmine when it comes to identifying the key elements of this movement. Let's start off with the editing. The scene's chaotic editing portrays elements of youth that are disorganized and animalistic and doesn't give a damn about anyone or anything, not even itself. This can especially be seen in the scene where the police officer gets shot. These series of jump cuts glance through the event as if the death is not too important to waste time on, and it immediately cuts to a shot of the man running away. Now, there is argument on why Godard chose to cut the film this way. Some say it's a clever attempt to turn around a film that would otherwise be a critical failure, but Godard himself says the elliptical editing of Breathless resulted from a need to reduce the length of the film. Either way, it's easy to argue that the editing style immensely contributed to the narrative of the film. The handheld camera movement whips around the scene, whether it's the point of view of the character or whether it's motivated by the movement of the subject on screen. The feeling of a soul behind the camera is clearly apparent. This documentary style also ties into how everything is shot in real locations using natural lights. This is possible partly due to the relatively small cameras that can be squeezed into small tight spaces, and of course budget restrictions. So no projecting backgrounds in car scenes like Hollywood. And here, the subject on screen turns to the camera, looks directly at the audience. This technique of breaking the fourth wall was a traditional cinema taboo, and we see this technique in many instances throughout the New Wave. This can be sometimes uncomfortable and also in a way immersive to the audience. This self-aware style of filmmaking ties into the idea that the audience should know that they're watching a film. And I believe that's the purpose of the Nouvelle Vague. They didn't try to conceal cinema as something real, they just accepted cinema and the quirks and the beauty that comes with it and presented it as, well, cinema. The French New Wave was created for the true love of the art form. This love letter to cinema was not only written with ink on paper or printed on sheets of cellulose 24 times a second, but it was carved in stone. This cinema we live today is deeply inspired and influenced by the cinema the Nouvelle Vague created, and will possibly influence filmmakers for the foreseeable future.
It's as if a couple of movie crazy young Frenchmen were in a coffee house, all right? And they've taken a banal American crime novel and they're making a movie out of it based not on the novel, but on the poetry that they read between the lines.